from 1800 to 1890. The third lecture covered the period from 1890 to 1965. So if you could all mute your mics, your microphones, so that there won't be any interference. So today we're going to look at immigration since 1965. The current system of legal immigration dates back to 1965 with the signing of the 1965 Immigration Act. And this law introduced some profound demographic changes in America. But that's not how the law was seen when it was passed in 1965. It was enacted at the height of the civil rights movement, at a time when the ideals of freedom and democracy and equality had really seized the attention of the country. And it was against that backdrop that the manner in which the United States decided which foreigners could and could not enter the country had become somewhat of an embarrassment under the old system, which had quotas for people from specific countries. So the old system, which was based on the 1924 Immigration Quota Act, their admission depended upon the country of birth of the immigrant. And so, as you can see from these pie charts, between 1881 and 1890, most immigrants had come from North or Western Europe. Between 1891 and 1900, a majority began to come in from Southern and Eastern Europe, and that trend continued through 1920. But after the 1924 Quota Act, that severely limited immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and once again, a majority of immigrants were coming from the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Germany after 1924. And there were long waiting lists of immigrants who wanted to come in from Italy, Poland, and other parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. So in effect, the 1924 law declared that Northern Europeans were more desirable than immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. There was an implication that Northern Europeans were a superior subspecies of the white race, that the Nordics were superior to people from Mediterranean countries, and they were superior to Jews and Asians. And that law, the 1924 law, succeeded in doing what it was intended to. So when we look at this chart, I'm sorry, let's go back to the previous one. Whereas in 1890, the foreign-born, sorry, we'll go to this one. In 1890, the foreign-born population of the United States was 14.8%. And after this 1924 law, you can see by 1965, the percentage of foreign-born in the United States dropped to 4.8%. And so that was the purpose of that 1924 law, to seriously limit immigration to the United States. But by the early 1960s, there were mounting calls to reform US immigration policy. And that was largely because of the growing strength of the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement of the 1960s focused on equal treatment, regardless of race or nationality. And so that led many people to look back on this quota system as discriminatory, as backward. President John F. Kennedy took up the cause of immigration reform in a speech in June of 1963, when he called the quota system intolerable. He said, quote, "We have removed all elements of second-class citizenship from our laws by Civil Rights Act, and now we have to do the same for immigration. Vice President Hubert Humphrey said, "We must, in 1965, remove all elements in our immigration law which suggests that there are second-class people." Now, after Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, Congress began debating, and it would eventually pass the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. That law was co-sponsored by Representative Emanuel Celler of New York and Senator Philip Hart of Michigan. And so the new law was officially called the HART-CELLER Immigration Act. And what it did was it abolished the 1924 Immigration Quota Act. It established a new immigration policy based on reuniting immigrant families and attracting skilled labor to the United States. So specifically, it abolished the 1924 Act. It eliminated the national origin, race, and ancestry as the basis for immigration and gave priority to relatives of citizens in the United States, as well as to professionals who had specialized skills. And so this new 1965 law committed the United States for the first time to accept immigrants of all nationalities on a roughly equal basis. But that is not what the law originally intended to do. Supporters of the law thought that it would bring immigration policy into line with other anti-discrimination measures, but that it would not fundamentally change the demography of the United States. Now, opponents of this law had argued that the United States was fundamentally a European country, and it should stay that way. Sam Ervin, the Democratic senator from North Carolina, said, "The people of Ethiopia have the same right to come to the United States under this bill as the people from England, the people from France, the people from Germany, and people of Holland." And he then said, "With all due respect to Ethiopia, I don't know of any contributions that Ethiopia has made to the making of America." So this expresses the view that America is basically a country of European descendants, and it should stay that way. The 1965 law would change that. Now, critics of the 1965 law highlighted the population explosion that was taking place in the developing world, and they predicted that the United States would soon find itself inundated by desperate migrants from poverty-stricken countries in the third world. And so this 1965 immigration overhaul was not really very popular with the American public. That was not what people were marching in the streets over in the 1960s. In the 1960s, people were demonstrating against the war in Vietnam and for civil rights, not for liberalizing immigration laws. But that is exactly what the 1965 law did. Only a few supporters of that legislation said the country could and should be willing to accommodate more immigrants of color. Those who supported this law denied that the proposed immigration reform would bring any significant shift in the pattern of immigration. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, testifying before Congress, said he saw no indication of, quote, "a world situation where everybody is just straining to move to the United States." And expert after expert testified before Congress that the 1965 law would really not change very much in America. Secretary of State Rusk repeatedly stressed that the number of new immigrants coming to the United States would not skyrocket, that what was really at stake, he argued, was the principle of a more open immigration policy. When he was asked about the number of people from India, for example, who would want to come to the United States, Rusk estimated, well, maybe about 8,000 from India over the next 5 years. But these assurances did not sway conservative critics of reform. But a last-minute change in the legislation language did alleviate the fears of a massive influx from Asia and Africa. The original version of the 1965 Act favored those immigrants whose skills were especially advantageous to the United States. But conservatives managed to change those priorities, giving visa preferences instead to foreigners who were seeking to join their families who were already in the United States. Now, because most immigrants who came to the United States before 1965 were from Northern and Western Europe, conservatives felt that if you allow members of their family to join them, that would not alter the racial demographics of the United States. Another provision was added to give preference to professionals with skills that were in short supply in the United States. Now, anti-immigrants assumed that family unification, again, would favor bringing people in from Northern and Western Europe, countries which at that time dominated the US population. So this 1965 Act allocated 170,000 visas to people in countries from the Eastern Hemisphere and 120,000 visas annually to countries in the Western Hemisphere. Each Eastern Hemisphere country was allowed this allotment of visas, while in the Western Hemisphere, there was no limit on any specific country. This was the first time any numerical limitation had been placed on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. Non-quota immigrants who were spouses, minor children, parents of US citizens under the age of 21, they would not be counted as part of the hemispheric or country ceiling. When President Johnson signed the Immigration and Naturalization Act at the foot of the symbolically powerful Statue of Liberty, he tried to downplay the significance of the law. He said, the bill that we signed today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or add importantly to either our wealth or power. It's a rather strange statement coming from the president, signing what really has become a watershed immigration law. Contrary to Johnson's assertions, the 1965 Immigration Act inaugurated a new era of mass immigration that has affected the lives of millions. Despite the protests of the Act's sponsors that the law would not change things radically, you can see from this chart how the 1965 law changed the national origin mix of immigrants. So if we look at this, you can see that until the 1965 law, most immigrants were coming from Europe. That's in this dark brown shade. But since the 1960s, there's been a dramatic increase of immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And the reason for this is that by the 1960s, most countries in Western and Northern Europe had become modernized, industrialized. They were prosperous. So there weren't very many people from Northern and Western Europe who wanted to immigrate to the United States, while tens of millions of others from the developing world were seeking better lives in America. So here's another way of looking at this. So you can see that Uh, Earlier in the 19th century, most immigrants were coming from Northern and Western Europe. And then from 1890 until the 1920s, immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then there was a rapid decline in immigration after the 1924 law. But after the 1965 Immigration Act, you get a tremendous spike of immigrants coming from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And so ending the national origins quota opened the doors to the mass entry of people from Asia and Latin America, as you can see here by this chart. So immigrants coming from Northern and Western Europe are in the blue shade. And so you had a large number from the 1820s to the 1890s. And then by the 1890s, you get immigrants from Italy, Russia, Hungary. And that ends with the Immigration Quota Act of 1924. And after the 1965 Act, you get large numbers of immigrants coming from Mexico, Philippines, China, Cuba. And the law's emphasis on family reunification ensured that those who came through the door first would be able to bring in their relatives. And that heightened emphasis on family unification led to the phenomena that we call chain migration. Now, what is chain migration? And that is that if an immigrant comes from Asia or Africa and becomes a naturalized citizen, then that opens the door to his or her brothers and sisters or spouses to come as well. And when they come, they could in turn sponsor their own brothers and sisters and spouses. So chain migration multiplied the number of immigrants coming from the developing world. And within a few decades, family unification became the driving force in US immigration. And it favored exactly those nationalities that critics of the 1965 Act had hoped to keep out. That is, people from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, because those are the people who are most determined to get to America. And so the unexpected result has been one of the greatest waves of immigration in American history. More than 18 million legal immigrants entered the United States in the years after the law was passed. And so here you could see the impact of the 1965 Act, a huge increase in immigration after 1965. And along with millions of legal immigrants, there were uncountable numbers of undocumented immigrants. And so this chart shows the percentage of unauthorized immigrants coming to the United States. So in 1990, I'm sorry, these are in whole numbers, 3.5 million in 1990. It peaked somewhere around 2007 at 12.2 million. And today, the number of unauthorized immigrants is put at roughly 11 million. And these new immigrants who have come since 1965 are more likely to stay than earlier immigrants, some of whom returned home after a stay in the United States. They were called those birds of passages, you may remember. So let's look at the immediate impact of this 1965 law. In the first 5 years after the bill's passage, immigration to the United States from Asian countries would more than quadruple, especially those fleeing war-torn Southeast Asia, Vietnamese and Cambodians. So you see on this map the blue and sort of pink lines. These are immigrants coming from Asia in the first 5 years after the passage of the 1965 Act. Other Cold War era conflicts during the 1960s and 70s also saw millions of people fleeing poverty or the hardships of communist regimes in Cuba, in Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. People seeking their fortune in the United States. By the end of the 20th century, the policies that were put into effect by the 1965 Act had greatly changed the face of the American population. Whereas in the 1950s, more than half of all immigrants were Europeans, as shown in this blue bar in the 1950s. Only 6% came from Asia. But by the 1990s, only 16% of immigrants were coming from Europe, 31% from Asia. And the percentages of Latino and African immigrants similarly increased significantly. In raw numbers, the total foreign born in the United States increased from 9.6 million in 1970 to 14.1 million in 1980, and then to 19.8 million by 1990. And a good many of them were also undocumented. And as you can see, by 2015, that number increased to 43.3 million. The growing gap between a booming American economy and a pre-industrial Central American agrarian economy pushed Mexicans and Guatemalans and Salvadorians to migrate to California and to the American Southwest. And those new immigrants and their children began to show up in growing numbers in schools and public clinics and hospital emergency rooms in the United States. And as a result, some regarded them as an increasing burden on taxpayers, on schools, and on other public institutions. And so a generation after the passage of the HART-CELLER bill, there would be attempts by federal and state governments to gain greater control over immigration. In May of 1975, the Texas state legislature denied state funding to any school district that had students who were not legally admitted into the United States. But a Supreme Court decision struck down that Texas law. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that under the 14th Amendment, all residents in the United States, whether legal or illegal, were entitled to the equal protection of the laws. In 1978, 65% of California voters approved Proposition 13, which severely limited, which severely limited local property taxes, a large share of which had gone to schools whose enrollment was increasingly Latino. So these are the pushbacks to the 1965 immigration law. And the country was increasingly concerned over undocumented immigrants. Their numbers grew considerably after the passage of the 1965 Act. And so this cartoon shows the concern of some Americans over these undocumented immigrants. Now, during the Reagan administration, Reagan signed an executive order to give a blanket amnesty for 3 million undocumented aliens. He said, "I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and lived here, even though sometime back they may have entered illegally." Now, as you know, Reagan was a conservative Republican. I doubt that conservative Republicans today would endorse a similar amnesty law. In 1986, Congress passed the Immigration Control and Reform Act, which tried to end illegal immigration on the one hand, while meeting the needs of agricultural growers for more workers on the other hand. So what the 1986 law did was it extended amnesty to those who could prove they had performed 90 days of farm work before the passage of this law. And it permitted 300,000 additional Mexican guest workers to enter the country because agricultural growers, particularly in California, needed these guest workers to work on the farms. But this law also provided for tighter border enforcement and criminal penalties for employers who knowingly hired undocumented workers. Finally, the authors of this bill promised that there would never be another such amnesty. But this amnesty only encouraged a new wave of undocumented individuals, many of them wives and children and siblings of those who had already been amnestied. And so between 1990 and 2006, the foreign-born population nearly doubled from 19.8 million to 37.5 million. Even the enhanced border enforcement included in the 1986 law only served to increase the number of undocumented in America. Why? Because before then, workers tended to shuttle between their homes in the Mexican interior to work temporarily in fields in the United States, and then they would return back to Mexico again. But with greater border enforcement, those migrants decided to stay in the United States rather than to return home to Mexico. So ironically, the enhanced border enforcement actually kept undocumented immigrants in the United States. So in 1990, when there were 3.5 million undocumented immigrants, that number tripled to 11.1 million just 15 years later. Under President Clinton, a 1994 act provided amnesty for an additional 578,000 undocumented aliens. But growing anger over illegal immigration in 1994 led California voters to approve Proposition 187, which I'm sure many of you remember. So, Prop 187 attempted to deny public education to anyone who was reasonably suspected of being an illegal alien in the United States. These terms depicted immigrants as criminals, just as de jure segregation conveyed the idea of inferiority of Mexican students. It required teachers and other officials to report those who were suspected of being in this country illegally. And so what Prop 187 promised to do was to deny virtually all public services to undocumented immigrants and their children. And that would have required every public employee to report them to immigration authorities. Prop 187 was endorsed by the Republican Governor Pete Wilson, and it passed with 59% of the vote. But it never went into effect. It was declared unconstitutional by the federal courts. a federal judge struck the measure down on the grounds that the control of immigration policy rests not with the states, but with Congress. Therefore, California's Prop 187 was unconstitutional because California has no right to decide on what services immigrants are entitled to. That is entirely up to Congress. In 1996, with a new majority in Congress, Republicans passed a major welfare reform bill that cut food stamps and other federal benefits to all immigrants, legal and undocumented. And in 1998, voters in California, followed by voters in Arizona and Massachusetts, ended bilingual education classes in public schools. Today, there's an estimated 11 million, I just want to point out that Prop 187 had real political implications. Because it was proposed by a Republican majority state legislature and a Republican governor, you can see that the impact was that after Prop 187, California voted Democratic. As the non-white population of California has increased, so has the Democratic vote. So California was largely a Republican state back in the 1960s, 1970s, and for part of the 1980s. But after that, it became a Democratic state. And that is in part because many Latino voters remembered Prop 187. So today there are an estimated 11 million undocumented people in the United States. Now, I'd like to give you a profile of these 11 million. 2/3 have resided in the United States for a decade or more. They have 4 million children have been born to undocumented people. And those children automatically become citizens because of the 14th Amendment. 1.5 million of the 11 million are married to US citizens. More than 3 million of the 11 million own their own homes. And collectively, the 11 million undocumented people in the United States today represent 5% of the American workforce. In Arizona, Sheriff Joe Arpaio made a national name for himself with the jailing and public humiliation of hundreds of undocumented immigrants. In 2017, he was found guilty of contempt of court for racial profiling, but he was pardoned by then President Trump just 1 month later. But that pardon undoubtedly motivated a huge Latino voter turnout in the 2020 election, and that turned Arizona Democratic. So I think the fact that Arizona went Democratic in this past election can be directly connected to the anti-immigration activities of Sheriff Arpaio. Now let us look at immigration policy under President George W. Bush. By the middle of the first decade of this century, the foreign-born represented a sizable minority of the American population. Nearly half of the 26% of the population that was foreign-born, nearly half of all public school students were children of immigrant fathers, and 1/4 were officially identified as English learners. There were similar proportions of foreign-born school children in Texas, Arizona, and New York, and other high immigrant states. And by the turn of the century, immigrants moved north and east where there were more jobs, where living expenses were lower, to places like Georgia, the Carolinas, to the Midwest, and into towns that had never seen anything but a white face before. And many of these were legal immigrants. But as brown faces spread into Iowa, Illinois, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Wisconsin, where many worked in the cold, wet, and sometimes dangerous jobs in the poultry and meatpacking industries, it was the illegal immigrants who got most of the attention. As a presidential candidate in 1999, George W. Bush defined immigration reform as one of his national priorities, reminding Latino voters that he spoke Spanish, that his brother, Jeb Bush, who was then Florida governor, was married to a Mexican-American woman. Candidate Bush in 1999 promised a guest worker program to allow more Mexicans to work in the United States and to establish a path to permanent legal residency and eventual citizenship for the roughly 3 million Mexicans then working illegally in the United States. But when he became president, he started to face strong opposition from members of his own party. They were against any guest worker program, and they were most vehemently opposed to any legalization of immigrants, which they labeled as an amnesty program. Then the 9/11 attacks immediately shifted the terrain of the debate to making border security the paramount issue for the Bush administration. So, facing a re-election campaign in 2004, George Bush returned to the Mexican immigration issue with the same political calculus that had driven his ambitions in 2000, that is, his quest for Latino votes. He tried to revive his earlier program, but Republican critics maintained that illegal workers were individuals who had broken American law, and thus they should be shown no favor. And so Congress then authorized $1.2 billion to begin constructing a 700-mile fence along the US-Mexican border. Though the border separating the two countries is more than 2,000 miles long, the construction of a fence along a small portion was largely a symbolic political gesture to placate conservative critics. Erecting a fence along one portion of the border simply shifted the movement of undocumented immigrants to other sections of the border. And it did absolutely nothing to curtail the roughly 40% of illegal immigrants who entered the country legally, but overstayed their visas. In 2007, Bush once again advanced an immigration plan to create a new temporary worker program, similar to the Bracero program that had been adopted during World War II. According to his Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act of 2007, workers would be able to register for legal status for a fixed period of time, but then they would be required to go back. It also called for an increased number, an increase in border controls to keep undocumented immigrants out. It was one of the top priorities of President Bush's second term. But Bush also called for giving some of the longtime undocumented a path to US citizenship, as long as they could meet the following criteria: that they paid their taxes, that they learned English, and had worked in a job for a number of years in order to qualify. But that Reform Act of 2007 failed. Conservative Republicans resisted any path to citizenship for individuals who had entered the country illegally. The immigration policy of President Obama we'll now look at. In June of 2012, he issued an executive order instituting what we call the DREAM Act, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And that allows young people who are brought to the country as children to apply for deportation deferrals and work permits. And so to date, there are more than 600,000 undocumented aliens who have been accepted into the DACA program. In November of 2014, President Obama issued a series of executive actions to grant up to 5 million unauthorized immigrants protection from deportation. Under that plan, which is called the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents, illegal immigrants under the age of 30 who came to America illegally before they were 16 would be protected from deportation and could apply for a 2-year work visa, which could also be renewed. It also provided that they must have lived in the United States continuously for at least 5 years. And they must not have committed any serious crimes, and they must have a high school diploma or a GED equivalent. Also, if they've served or currently serving in the military. Obama said the plan was not a permanent solution, that it did not provide a path to citizenship for the young immigrants, but rather he saw it as a stopgap measure until Congress could pass long-term comprehensive immigration reform. However, a coalition of 26 states, led by Texas, challenged this plan. They accused the president of abusing the power of his office by trying to circumvent Congress, because this was an executive order. And in 2015, a lower court invalidated Obama's Deferred Action for Parents plan. And so this cartoon shows the court rejecting Obama's executive action. And the government appealed. The Supreme Court was split 4-4 over Obama's plan. And that meant that the lower court ruling stood, preventing this executive action. And all of this virtually guaranteed that the issue of immigration would take center stage in the 2016 presidential election. As a footnote, while Obama vigorously pushed for immigration reform, his administration had deported more people than any previous presidential administration. So here you can see the numbers of illegal aliens removed from the United States, and the number increases and reached a high under President Obama. He deported more people than all of the presidents of the 20th century combined. And so some refer to Barack Obama as the deporter-in-chief. In December of 2012, 4 Democratic and 4 Republican senators, known as the Gang of 8, began drafting a comprehensive immigration reform bill, one that would provide a pathway to citizenship for the more than 11 million undocumented immigrants. In June of 2013, it passed in the Senate with a bipartisan majority. But then in the House, Speaker John Boehner, yielding to right-wing opposition, refused to bring it to a vote. And so this bipartisan bill died in the House of Representatives. Donald Trump staked his primary campaign on an unwavering hardline position against immigration, claiming when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their very best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some I assume are good people. In the 2016 campaign, he called for the following: mass deportations of all undocumented immigrants. He called for a temporary ban on Muslim immigration and a border wall that he said Mexico would pay for. The approach also initially put him at odds with other Republicans who saw unconditional deportation as unrealistic and lacking in compassion. Trump forcefully criticized Senator Marco Rubio of Florida during the primary debates. He criticized Rubio for working with the Gang of Eight, saying that Rubio was for amnesty. And then Trump denounced Senator Ted Cruz of Texas for a similar position. In the 2016 campaign, Trump said he would like to see an end to birthright citizenship. He said that children born to undocumented parents should not be granted US citizenship, even though the 14th Amendment says, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. It says all persons, not all citizens. Since winning the 2016 election and becoming president, Trump issued executive orders that called for the Department of Homeland Security planning, designing, and constructing a wall along the southern border, adding 5,000 more Border Patrol agents to increase the total number of agents to about 25,000, forbidding sanctuary jurisdictions, that is, sanctuary cities, from receiving federal grants. In these sanctuary cities, local police departments refuse to contact immigrant authorities when they apprehend someone who may be in the country illegally. Sanctuary cities say that contacting immigration officials may impair the relationship they have with the local community, and that could lead to racial profiling. So Trump's executive order would forbid these sanctuary cities from receiving any federal grants. His executive order also called for increasing ICE agents by an additional 10,000, thereby tripling the number of agents, and reducing the number of refugees to be admitted annually to the United States from 110,000 to 50,000. It also called for a halt of resettlement of Syrian refugees. And the Muslim ban suspended the issuance of visas for people coming from Iran, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, and North Korea. Trump also pushed for ending what is called the catch and release policy that allowed people who are detained after arriving illegally in the United States to be released from custody while awaiting decisions on whether they could stay. Trump called for an end to this policy. He also called for an end to the visa lottery system, as well as an end to chain migration, even though Melania's parents were allowed entry into the United States by the way of chain migration. The visa lottery system allows 50,000 people a year from low migration countries to come to the United States. But Trump claimed, quote, they give us their worst people, the worst of the worst. Actually, the recipients of the lottery program must have the equivalent of the US high school education or skills in computers, medicine, or other professions. Hardly the worst of the worst. In Trump's criticism of chain migration, he claimed, quote, under the current broken system, a single immigrant can bring in virtually unlimited numbers of distant relatives. But in fact, immigrants can only bring in members of their nuclear family through a process that is quite arduous. Trump called for changes to make it more difficult for asylum seekers to demonstrate credible fear about returning to their home countries. And arrests of undocumented immigrants increased 40% after Trump took office in January of 2017. When he was discussing possible immigration from Haiti and from African nations, Trump asked, why should America want immigrants from these shithole countries, quote unquote. He then said we should have more people coming from places like Norway. Now, I wonder why he chose Norway. Critics pointed out that African immigrants, however, are actually better educated than people born in the United States. Of the 1.4 million African immigrants over the age of 25, it was determined that 41% had bachelor degrees, compared to only 32% of the US born population, and compared to 38% of immigrants from Norway. So African immigrants are actually better educated than the general US population, or better educated than immigrants from Norway. 16% of immigrants from Africa had advanced degrees, as compared to just 11% from native-born Americans. So all of this to refute Trump's claim that immigrants coming from so-called shithole nations are making America worse off. Now, concerning the issue of DACA, in September of 2017, Trump announced an end to the DACA program, which was protecting nearly 700,000 undocumented immigrants from deportation. Trump set the official termination date for DACA for March 5th, 2018. However, the Supreme Court this past June passed a ruling that allowed the Dreamers to stay in the United States. In April of 2018, federal authorities separated children and infants from parents who had entered the United States. The parents were prosecuted and held in federal jails, or they were deported. Their children were placed under the supervision of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The official government number of children separated from their parents under this policy was about 4,368. That sparked widespread protest. And so the policy of family separation was suspended 2 months later. But that policy did not include any measure to reunite families that had been separated. It's estimated now that there are more than 600 children remaining separated from their parents. These 600 children live in the United States, and they have still not been reunited with their parents. On January 20th, President Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order to create a task force to reunify families separated during the Trump administration. So hopefully, those 600 children will ultimately get reunited with their families. More recently, Biden sent to Congress a bill called the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. And this represents the most sweeping immigration overhaul in generations. Biden's bill would pave a pathway to citizenship for nearly all undocumented immigrants living in the United States. It would increase legal immigration to the United States and speed up consideration of asylum seekers. It would also take steps to secure the country's border and ports of entry, while investing $4 billion in the economies of Central American countries as a way to lessen the incentive for people to leave those countries to come to the United States. This Citizenship Act of 2021 would strike out the word alien from federal law in favor of non-citizen. And it would permit undocumented people to apply for temporary legal status and then for green cards 5 years later. Now, allowing immigrants to stay in this country has the support of roughly 3/4 of Americans. Even a slim majority of Republicans support allowing immigrants, documented or undocumented, to stay in this country. They support the idea of permitting immigrants to apply for citizenship, as well as undocumented immigrants. 65% of Americans support this. But this proposed Citizenship Act of 2021 will most likely be opposed by most Republicans. One of the reasons Republicans are opposed to this bill is that it requires ICE officers to get pre-approval before taking any enforcement act against any undocumented alien. So before ICE can take action against an undocumented immigrant, it would have to get some kind of pre-approval from the courts. However, if the undocumented immigrant represents a threat to national security or has a criminal record, or something of that serious nature, then pre-approval is not necessary. But taken as a whole, it seems unlikely that this Citizenship Act of 2021 will gain the necessary 60 senators' approval as the bill stands. So we'll have to see what happens with this. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up these 4 lectures by saying that the United States has more immigrants than any country in the world. Today, there are some 45 million people living in the United States who were born in another country. They account for 1/5 of the world's migrants. So 1 out of every 5 migrants in the world come to the United States. The population of immigrants to this country is very diverse, with just about every country in the world represented among US immigrants. Over these past 4 lectures, we've seen that Americans have been very ambivalent about immigration, and that ambivalence continues today. Anti-immigrant sentiment is particularly strong in some sections of the United States today. But some of the anti-immigrant arguments are shrouded in collective amnesia. Nativist rhetoric includes claims that immigrants today are living off of handouts, that immigrants today are not interested in assimilating, and some even assert that some immigrants are coming here to kill us. Anti-immigrant voices maintain that immigrants earlier in American history were very different, that Immigrants of old worked 12 jobs and never took a cent from anyone, that they easily adapted to life in America, that they cast off all traces of their native countries, and that they burned the midnight oil to learn English as soon as possible. But is that really accurate? Census records of the early 20th century reveal that many immigrants never learned to speak English, some even after living in the United States for decades. For example, a 1911 congressional study found that of 246,000 immigrants working in mines and industry, only 53% were able to speak English. That same commission found that nationwide, roughly 38% of charity was given to immigrants. And so I think this cartoon represents the sort of blindness of the anti-immigrant view today. So the cartoon begins where this senior American citizen says, "My grandfather came to this country in 1897. He and grandma worked day and night to send my father to school. Father went into business, worked hard, made his way up. I joined father, and together we won our share of the American dream. But these Cubans, Haitians, and Mexicans forget the difference between grandfather and them. They're too late." So I'm sure you have heard these arguments that somehow earlier immigrants were of a better class than more recent immigrants. But the facts belie that. Immigrants currently represent 13.5%, at least by 2015, 13.5% of the total US population. And that's the highest percentage in over 100 years. The Census Bureau projects that by 2060, the immigrant share of the population will reach 19%. And some critics ask, can the nation's schools and infrastructure absorb so many immigrants? They wonder, how will the least skilled Americans make it in a labor market competition with native-born workers? How many immigrants can the United States assimilate into its culture? Now, the United States is hardly the only country with a streak of anti-immigration nativism and xenophobia. But we are the only nation founded on the principles of equality and opportunity. And in the past, the United States has been a safe haven for the oppressed. Almost everything that has been said about shutting down immigration today has been said earlier in American history. So you can replace Irish or Italian or Jews with Mexicans and Muslims. And what comes from immigration restrictions today is an echo of what nativists said more than a century ago, that they were taking jobs away from native-born Americans, that they were a threat to the country, that they could never become real Americans. But anti-immigrant sentiment becomes politically popular in times of economic crisis. And that's one of the reasons why the struggling working class in America today found Trump's anti-immigrant policies so appealing. But just to conclude and give a historical perspective on illegal immigration, I'd like to share this cartoon. So the point is, of course, that we are all immigrants, legal or illegal. Okay, so that concludes my take on the history of immigration in America. And now we have time for your questions and comments.